So this takes the complexity of human development, of why some cultures ended up rich and powerful and relatively free, and some cultures remain mired in the Stone Age and so on. And it kind of reduces it to the resource argument. Now, this is a very tempting argument, and I understand why people think this. But there are some questions as to what does it mean to say that Europe is rich because it strip mined resources from Africa. Now, Africans had Africa. You could say that the length of time backwards that Homo sapiens go, about 150,000 years or so. So blacks had Africa for about 150,000 years, minus a couple hundred for the colonial period. And in sub-Saharan Africa, when the Europeans arrived, there were no wheels really, no written language, no two-story buildings, none of that stuff. And so that's a challenge. So to say that it's because the Europeans took these resources and that's why Europe's rich, I understand the argument, I really do. Because you see these ships sailing with slaves and with gold and with diamonds and so on from Europe, from Africa to Europe and to the North Americas. And then these countries, the European countries, the North American countries, they become wealthy. And so the temptation is to say, well, they became wealthy because they stole. But it doesn't really hold up. Because if it is resources that make you rich, and Africa was in possession of these resources for 150,000 years and did not become rich, then the mere possession of resources doesn't make you rich. This is not a very challenging argument. And it shows just how politically correct and how unspeakable many of these things are to just have this basic argument. If the possession of resources makes you wealthy, and the reason that Europe is wealthy is it took the resources from Africa a couple of hundred years ago, then why did Africa not become wealthy when it sat on these resources for 150,000 years? Now, another argument, of course, says, and it's tough because in Europe there wasn't slavery in the same way, but the argument is that America is wealthy, and the reason that America is wealthy is that it got its wealth on the backs of slaves, the black slaves from sub-Saharan Africa. Again, that's a hypothesis. And if we want to be philosophical, which I hope we do, at least on this channel, if we want to be rational, if we want to examine the evidence, we say, okay, that's a hypothesis that says slavery produces massive wealth. Massive wealth. I mean, if you look at the line of human income, human wealth, it's like completely flatlined for about 150,000 years, give or take. And then over the last few hundred years, it's gone through the stratosphere, like 20 times, 30 times, 40 times. But just look over the past decade or so. Poverty has been cut in half around the world. So the hypothesis is slavery produces wealth. America was rich because it had slaves and it built its wealth on the backs of slaves. Well, okay, so if we just strip all the politically correct stuff out of that and look at that rationally, we say, okay, well, that's a hypothesis, right? So what we would do is we would look at countries or times in history where slavery was practiced the most, and we would say, did those countries become rich? Right? That's the argument. Slavery produces wealth. Okay. Well, in Africa, slavery was common. And so if slavery produces wealth, then Africa, which practiced slavery mostly through most countries in the continent, why did Africa not become rich? If slavery produces wealth and the Africans bought and sold each other as slaves, why did they not become rich? Tens of millions of blacks were shipped to Muslim countries where they were mostly castrated, the males, along the way. This is why there's not a big black population in the Middle East at the moment. Why did the Middle East not become rich? The indigenous population of North America, what are called the Indians, they practiced slavery. Why did they not become rich? In South and Central America, you had the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas, and so on. They practiced slavery. Why did they not become rich? These aren't that complicated a set of questions, are they? I mean, am I just completely blind as to why we want to answer questions, right? We have a hypothesis. We want to answer questions. If exploitation of workers, if the pillaging and exploitation of workers makes countries rich? Well, was it true that the Egyptians, in building the pyramids, did not exploit their workers? Was there no exploitation of workers in the Middle Ages when you had serfs literally tied to the land? Was there no exploitation of workers in ancient Athens, in ancient Rome, in the Roman Empire, where there were huge numbers of slaves? Why did they not achieve modern levels of wealth if slavery produces all of this wealth? And to ask these questions is to answer them. And so I think that's important to kind of focus on in the movie. The movie is attempting to answer the question, why do black communities do badly? And the answer, because there are two answers. And the one answer is, white oppression, white slavery, white exploitation, white pillaging of resources in Africa and so on. That's one hypothesis as to why white countries do well relatively and black countries do badly, or black areas do badly relatively. That's one explanation. Now, there's another explanation, which I've talked about a lot on this show. I'm not going to get into it because I really want to focus on the movie. I'm just going to call it the hypothesis that dare not speak its name. Let's call it the Voldemort hypothesis. There's the Voldemort hypothesis, and then there's the white colonialism and racism hypothesis. One leads to a lot of conflict. The other one leads to, leads down the scientific pathway of facts. Now, there are black societies that were not colonized, and there are black societies that have been free from colonialism look at Haiti, right? 400 years been free of colonialism. Haiti took a bit of a step backward in the late 18th century when they killed all the whites that were on the island. So 400 years, Haiti's still doing terribly, and say, but 400 years, well, they had debts to pay, and so there were after effects of colonialism. And it's like, well, okay, but it wasn't bombed with 2 nuclear weapons, say. It wasn't firebombed from end to end like Japan was in the Second World War, like Germany, completely destroyed from end to end. And Japan, the entire structure of the society changed. And you had millions killed and firebombings over Tokyo that killed more than 100,000 people in a single night. You got Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and so on. And Germany and Japan did pretty well after the Second World War. It did not take them very long for them to achieve things. I mean, the Holocaust, for heaven's sakes. You had Jews arriving with a few bucks in their pocket who took, after they arrived in America, about 4 years to achieve income parity with the native population, with the white population. So it's tough. It's tough to figure out all of this stuff. And of course, if the transfer of resources produces wealth, right? If the reason why Europe was wealthy was because it took all the resources from Africa and other places, then if you look at the welfare state, if you look at affirmative action, if you look at the Head Start program, if you look at a wide variety of mechanisms by which hundreds of billions of dollars were transferred to the black community, then that is by far a larger transfer of wealth that has gone to the black community in the West, particularly in America, of course, than the Europeans ever took out of Africa, and that has not made the black community wealthy. So transfer of resources doesn't answer. Now, the Voldemort hypothesis does answer this, but I'll put a link below if you want to get into more of this. So people say, well, there were all these ships taking resources from Africa to Europe, and then Europe was rich, and therefore, right, that's why Europe became rich. But the question is, why were there ships in the first place? Because Europe was already wealthy. Why did it have a need or a use for all of this, all of these resources? Because it already had a relatively free economy. It already had a relatively stable political system, relatively objective laws. And so it's the cause and effect. That's sort of important. So let's talk about a couple of the ideas that were going on in the movie.